I would like to welcome back Dr. Angel Nicolaou-Konnari, an associate professor in medieval history at the University of Cyprus, specializing in the field of Hellenism under Latin rule. I'm so honored to have her back because she's agreed to return to talk about women, specifically in the medieval period of Cyprus. Angel, welcome back to the History of Cyprus podcast.
Thank you, Andreas. Very happy to be back.
Thank you so much. So we are talking about women in medieval Cyprus, and as we did last time when we talked about Richard, we started talking about the sources for the period. And for this particular topic, it is really difficult, I would think, because women in antiquity and women in the medieval period, they're typically marginalized, at least in the sources. And you actually even talk a lot about the masculinity of the sources. So I just want to start off by saying, what does that mean? And how do historians piece together women's conspicuous absence in the sources? How do you fill in those gaps?
Well, when we talk about the masculinity of the sources, we mean that all the written sources we have from the Middle Ages emanate from male authors and are addressed to a male audience. And they also have a male perspective. The only exception is material evidence, which, however, is material evidence when it is not military, because military material evidence is also masculine, as well as religious material evidence is masculine to a great extent. But if we have, everyday material evidence, we can piece together information about women. So, with written sources, what we usually do, um, we are asked to collect all scattered information about women from a great variety of sources written in various languages. Some of them are dead languages, and try to piece together the place and role of half of the society's population. So, women who represent half or perhaps more of a society's population are very, very poorly represented in sources written by men and addressed to men. This is why our data, our information is scattered, discontinuous, and it is, especially in the case of Cyprus, impossible to address important family or gender issues such as health, private life, education, marriage, maternity, prostitution. We cannot address these issues globally, and we cannot give statistics because our information is scattered, is discontinued. We are collect pieces of evidence and from a variety of sources. We don't have no archives have survived in Cyprus, unlike places like Paris or London, where the town, the city's archives have survived. In the case of Cyprus, no archives have survived. So our information, I repeat, is very little. It's of a discontinuous nature, and we piece together a picture that is not definitely not complete.
And so a lot of what you do is you draw on notarial deeds to kind of help fill in those gaps for this period. So what are some of those shortcomings, challenges, drawbacks, or alternatively, how do they actually help elucidate the period?
Well, we're just lucky, an accident of history has allowed the survival of an important number of notarial acts 2333, uh, which were drafted in Famagusta, because Famagusta in medieval Cyprus, especially in a period from the end of the 13th century to more or less the end of the 14th, Famagusta was a very, very important trade center in the area. And this is why we have so many notarial acts drafted in the city. In these notarial acts or deeds, women emerge with a certain identity. If we combine the information found in these deeds with the scattered information in narrative sources, ecclesiastical sources, legal sources, literary sources, we can more or less draw a portrait of the role of women, of the place of women in medieval Famagusta and medieval Cyprus. Now, the shortcomings of these notarial deeds, um, they provide an incomplete and perhaps distorted picture because uh, not all female groups are represented in them, and not all Cypriot towns are represented on them. These notarial deeds were written by Italian notaries, Genoese and Venetian. So Italian women are overrepresented, obviously. On the other hand, we don't have information in these deeds about other ethnic groups: Franks, Syrians, Armenians, Jews, non Italian Westerners. Also, in these deeds, mainly burgess women are represented. We don't have much information on noble women because Famagusta was not the capital of Cyprus. So most of the women who use the services of this or who are mentioned in these deeds are not noble. So we have, ethnically speaking, an over representation of Italian women, and socially speaking, an over representation of burgess women. We don't have many noble women, we don't have free peasants, we don't have serfs, and of course, we don't see other social groups.
A lot of the other information for this period is based on the Bulla Kypria and the Assizes. And these two documents are very important for the period and understanding sort of the social and legal relationships of women and men. So, can you explain to listeners what these two documents are and how they help us better understand women in the period?
Yes, the Bulla Kypria, as the name says, was an agreement between the Greek and the Latin Church of Cyprus, issued by the Pope, hence Bulla. The Pope was Alexander IV, and it was issued in 1260. And this was an agreement between the Greek and the Latin Church of Cyprus. It was a kind of compromise which did not involve change of right for the Greek population. The Greeks were allowed to continue, to practice religion according to the Orthodox rite. The agreement involved only canonical obedience and hierarchical submission of the Greek high clergy to the Latin one. In other words, the Greek high clergy, the Orthodox high clergy, were subordinated to the Latin clergy. But the Bulla Gibria is very, very important religiously because it allowed the Orthodox population of Cyprus to continue to be Orthodox. And it also it's very important for women because it allowed the Orthodox Church of the island to continue to maintain the ecclesiastical courts, the Orthodox ecclesiastical courts, which were responsible for family law, marriage, engagement, marriage, divorces. So this is very important for women. Now, the Assize or Assise of Jerusalem and Cyprus, it was the legal system. The Lusignans introduced to Cyprus the legal system of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. From the very, very beginning, the Lusignans introduced the legal system of Jerusalem to Ireland. And this legal system, it was a feudal legal system. This legal system was described in a corpus of 13th century treatises, collectively known as the Assise de Jérusalem. We have Assise de la Haute Cour, assizes of the High Court. The High Court is the court that regulated relationships between the king and his vassals. And we also have Assise de la Cour de Bourgeois, or assizes of the court of the burgesses, which was responsible for civil and private law and penal law for all citizens, including the nobility.
So you mentioned a lot about sort of the framework that these two documents set up for women in the period. Let's start by talking about women's legal status then, because I think a lot of that is laid out in those documents. And one of the questions that I had in preparing for this is, essentially, what was their legal status? I mean, could women inherit property or testify in court? There was this one really interesting tidbit of information in one article of yours where you mentioned that if a woman was battered, she could take her husband to court, but could a non-noble woman do the same? For example, how balanced was this application of the law?
Well, the law is very fair. Actually, the law is surprisingly fair. Obviously, the women had no political status except when they inherited the throne. So women couldn't participate in the high court, but their legal status was almost the same with that of men. Obviously, we're talking about a feudal society, a military society, so the men are privileged, but not in the eyes of the law. Women share the same legal rights and the same human rights, if you like, despite some disabilities. For example, noble women could inherit a fief, something noble women in France, for example, at the same time, were not allowed to do. And noble women in Cyprus could inherit a fief, which means that they could also inherit the throne, because the throne is a kind of fief. In the main, their position as defendants was the same with men. Some disabilities were, of course, they did have some disabilities in the eyes of the law. For example, they couldn't bear testimony at court because women couldn't fight. So if the witness was asked to fight a judicial duel on behalf of the defendant, a woman couldn't do it. And this is the reason why a woman and a child couldn't bear testimony, on the grounds that they couldn't bear arms. They had a few more disabilities in the law. They needed, the presence of the husband or of the father to for other on other occasions. But generally, they had the same privileges in the eyes of the law, the same rights as men. Some provisions even favor women. For example, there is one interesting provision for noble women, a provision of the High Court, which says that the only circumstances in which a fief owing a single knight to lord could be divided was when there were several female heirs in the same degree of relationship. So sisters could inherit a fief, all two or three or five of them, but not brothers. Also, there's another provision which says that the capital punishment for the same crimes was hanging for men and burning for women. We cannot really understand why, but this is what the law says. But generally, as far as the assize of the High Court are concerned, women had the same, more or less the same rights with men. And the same is true for the Court of Burgesses. As I said before, the Court of Burgesses was responsible for civil and private law for free women and penal law for all citizens, including the nobility. And in the assize of the Court of Burgesses, the space attributed to women litigants is almost the same with the respective one for men, and the legislator is always careful to specify that the law is intended to safeguard the rights of all men and women. And every time we have, the specific word homme or femme, père, mère, fils, fille, and so on. The legislator is very careful to specify that either man or woman should do that, shouldn't do that. Penalties are also determined by social hierarchy and not by gender. Again, women have certain were faced with certain legal disabilities that rendered them dependent on men. Like in the case of noble women, a burgess woman couldn't offer testimony in court against a man, and she couldn't plead in court in the absence of her husband or witness a will. But generally speaking, the Court of Burgesses placed women and men on an equal standing.
Yeah, I found it really interesting to learn that they were also so involved in financial affairs. I mean, I know you mentioned that they could inherit fiefs, but there was also cases where they're executors of wills, money lenders, and even investors. So is this highly unusual for the period and very unique to Cyprus? No, what's your take on that? How unusual is that for the period?
Um, it's not unusual. Uh, First of all, we have to consider the economic situation of Famagusta at the end of the 13th century and the 14th century until the second half of the 14th century. Famagusta witnessed an economic boom and a demographic increase thanks to its role as a trade center. These allowed women to get involved in business, and this was also enhanced by high male mortality at the time. And this is not only a Cypriot phenomenon, we have the same phenomenon in Italian maritime cities of the time. In Genoa, in Venice, women are actively involved in the trade business. Of course, this was not socially condoned, but women did form an important part of Famagustan labor force. And widows are more active because they had more money to invest and because they were more independent. And it was socially accepted that a widow would go into business in order to provide for her family.
So, what sort of social restrictions and expectations were placed on women at the time? And I say this because you mentioned a lot about one historical figure of the time, Philip of Novara, who wrote a lot about the, I believe it's called the four stages of life. And his understanding was that they should refrain from joking and talking. But on the other hand, we have other Greek sources that honor or celebrate women for their beauty, wisdom, and learning. So I guess my question here is, what sort of social restrictions and expectations were placed on women, and were they different for Greeks and Latins?
Not really. The conventional portrait of the ideal woman was the same for both Latins and Greeks. And as you mentioned, we can see it in moral treatises like the one written by Philippe de Novar in the 13th century. Um, he this portrait of the ideal woman revolves around um, a woman's biological role, marriage, motherhood, and family at large. So, a girl's upbringing should prepare her to be a good housewife, a good mother, and a good wife. Modesty and honor were very important for women and more than for men. So they should refrain from um, joking in public, laughing loudly in public, using foul language, talking too much, because they should show this image of the modest, shy, honorable woman. And I think this is a portrait, this is a model behavior that applies to both the Latins and the Greeks. This is why the typical female occupations for a woman at the time were in the family business, for example. A woman who works in the family business, this is something accepted, socially condoned. Or a woman who works from home, either as a seamstress or as a producer of, I don't know, food products or whatever. Uh, and of course, domestic servants, that was accepted for a woman to be. And paramedical professions, midwives, nurses of children, these are professions accepted for women. But of course, we find professions which are less socially accepted, such as prostitutes, hostel owners, tavern owners. All these are professions, connected with each other. Usually, prostitution took place in a hostel or in a tavern.
I want to circle back to something you had mentioned about the ecclesiastical courts. To what extent did the Orthodox ecclesiastical courts continue to govern, and what were they essentially responsible for? Because you alluded to that when you were talking about the Bulla Cypria, and what were really the differences between these Orthodox and Latin laws in these ecclesiastical courts?
Well, first, let me say that the Lusignans were very, very tolerant. And although they introduced the law of the kingdom, the feudal law of the kingdom of Jerusalem, which we see in the High Court and in the Court of the Burgesses. At the same time, because they were the kings of a multicultural, multi-ethnic society, they allowed for legal pluralism. So, one of these forms of legal pluralism were the ecclesiastical courts. Both the Latin and the Greek ecclesiastical courts were responsible for family law, matrimonial matters, engagement, marriage, separation. And this, of course, included also successoral law and sexual and criminal offenses against one's spouse. For example, the case of a woman accusing a man of having unnatural intercourse with her or of battering her. All these were cases heard before the ecclesiastical courts. They were very, very active, and they actually gave both the Greek and the Latin church a kind of autonomy, and a kind of state within a state situation, especially in the case of the Greeks. It supplied the Orthodox Church with the role, if you like, of the leader of the Greek community, a role maintained throughout the the Ottoman period as well. Um, Now, these courts, the Latin and the Greek ecclesiastical courts, had some differences that involved the age of marriage, the rules of governing consanguinity and affinity, which stands until today. For example, the Orthodox Church allows the contraction of marriage between persons related to the fifth degree, that's third cousins. The Orthodox Church allows third cousins to get married, while the Latin Church prohibits it. So there are differences of this sort: the age of marriage, the degree of affinity, the liberty of a woman to marry at will, the reasons for separation. There are different reasons. But generally, both ecclesiastical courts dealt with the same nature of cases, family law.
Interesting that you mentioned the marriage for cousins, because I was surprised to learn that in Cyprus the Latin Church gave special dispensation to Latin nobility to marry cousins of the third and even second degree in some cases. Why was that allowed? How was this justified when it was illegal otherwise?
Well, like in the rest of the medieval societies of the medieval feudal societies of the time, the Frankish nobility in Cyprus practiced ethnic and social endogamy. So they married within the small circle of the Frankish nobility because they wanted to maintain the class privileges. But given the small number of the Frankish population, this at some stage became impossible. They were all related amongst themselves. So the Frankish nobility had to ask the Pope for what we call dispensations for marriages to be contracted within the prohibited degrees of consanguinity. Um, Third cousins and even second cousins. The grounds for the demand, we still have the letters sent to the Pope, and the grounds on behalf of the Frankish nobility for these demands was that it was not easy for Cypriots to find partners to marry who were not related to them and who were of equal noble standing, because Cyprus was a small island, predominantly Greek, and surrounded by infidels.
Yeah, and I do understand the predicament that this would put the
Yes.
Latin nobility in, right? Um, it's interesting. You write that women in particular demonstrated religious tolerance, probably produced by the proximity of everyday life in the town that allowed close contacts with women belonging to other religious communities.
course.
And I think King Peter the First actually complained that women were attending Greek and other schismatic churches. So, what was the degree of interaction between these various communities? The women, the Cypriot women of the Latin nobility, and the other communities, Greek or otherwise.
Well, I mean,
What sort of interaction did they have?
course, we may only surmise, huh? But I mean, it's easy to say that they were very close. I mean, after all, they were. We have to bear in mind that the two cultures were very compatible from the beginning. We have Christian Latin Christian Westerners and Orthodox Christian Easterners. Okay, they both cultural or ethnic groups are Christians. They are their culture is based on Judaism and Greco-Roman culture. So we're talking about really compatible cultures. Obviously, socially, it's a very 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 divided society. But that was the case under the Byzantines also. Okay, socially. So we think that from the very beginning, there were close relations, and especially women who stayed at home, and they had to mix with women of other ethnicities. They realized very early that we share the same religion. Only the rite changes, but it's not that important after all. And we have cases of Latin women attending Orthodox churches, or of both Orthodox and Latin women going on the same religious procession, praying together. We have traces in the sources of phenomena like that. In cases of epidemics, for example, they all prayed together, and the priests of all rites participated in the same procession. But it was definitely easier for women to do it than for men.
Typical of the period, and not just in Cyprus, women are perceived by the church as either good models, the Virgin, or evil, right? And you think of Eve. How are women of power depicted in the non-ecclesiastical sources? And I'm thinking of one character in particular, Eleanor of Aragon, for example, who I believe in the Chronicle of Leon Dios Majeras mentions this really terrible story of her forcing the miscarriage of her husband's lover's child. Again, not a surprise. These extramarital affairs not blamed on the men, but blamed on the women as
Yes.
seductresses, right? Uh,
Yeah.
is this typical of the sources? I mean, how often do we have women portrayed in those black and white terms?
Yes, it's quite typical actually. Eleanor of Aragon, women were expected, to follow the model of the modest, obedient woman described by moral treatises. Women, as we said, inherited fiefs. They could have some political power. They could be queens. But again, they were supposed to not to go beyond the traditional, even if she were a queen, not to go beyond the traditional role of a woman. And Eleanor of Aragon apparently went beyond that traditional role. She was the wife of Peter the First. She's depicted by Maheras. He's a 15th century Cypriot chronicler who wrote in the Cypriot dialect of the time. So she's depicted as an unfaithful wife who tortured her husband's mistress to make her miscarry. Although her husband, Peter the First, had mistresses, and Maheras speaks about these mistresses, He's said to be Maheras sort of justifies his behavior. He says that he loved his wife, but he was unfaithful because he was really a strong, brave man and he needed extramarital affairs. Ήταν βέβαιος άνθρωπος, Maheras says. When Eleanor paid him the same way and she had an affair, this is not condoned by Maheras. Maheras really judges her very, very negatively. He also describes her as a manipulative mother, plotting and scheming ruthlessly. Her actions led to Famagusta's conquest by Genoa in 1377. In other words, although she may have been really not a very, very easy person, she's definitely demonized by Maheras as an example of a woman in power who goes beyond her traditional role. Now, Alice of Mallorca, on the other hand, she said she was a noble woman whose story illustrates the moral anarchy after Peter the First, Peter the First's regicide. The king was killed, and after the war with Genoa in 1373-74, after the coup against Peter and his murder, and after the war with Genoa, apparently there was a moral anarchy on the island, and Alice of Mallorca is representative of this situation. She's said to have intrigued twice against her husband. Her husband was 20 years her senior, with her two lovers in order to kill her husband. So she's really described as the example of an immoral woman.
When I think of travelers to Cyprus in the medieval period and even later, there's a lot of stereotypical impressions of the common Cypriot woman as being lewd and licentious, often actually contrasts with their observations of seeing veiled and modest women. So where are these perceptions of the Cypriot woman rooted? Because Cyprus, or women in particular, have this reputation amongst travelers coming to Cyprus.
Well, this is a commonplace in contemporary literature and travelers' accounts. Cypriot women were lustful and lewd and licentious. Um, and it is a behavior attributed to the combination of hot weather and wine consumption, and it is also a behavior associated with the ancient cult of Venus, of Aphrodite on the island. So Cypriot women are supposed to be the descendants, of Aphrodite. Of course, it may also be connected with the Christian belief that women are more prone to immoral behavior. Eve, for example. But yes, we certainly do find this commonplace description in contemporary literature.
So with that being said, how did women dress? Because as I mentioned, when travelers are coming through the island, they have these perceptions of women being lewd, like you mentioned. But on the other hand, a lot of travelers, I think of James of Verona, mentions that women in Cyprus are modestly dressed. They cover their heads. They are rarely seen outside of after sundown. They're rarely seen. What do we know about women's dress in this period?
Our evidence comes from frescoes in churches, icons, tombstones, and illuminated manuscripts. Apparently, from this visual evidence, they dressed quite modestly. So, this is why I keep saying that this stereotype about women of Cyprus being lustful is It's just a literary topos, a literary commonplace. In reality, it seems that they dressed quite modestly, covered, from head to feet, the same way women dressed everywhere in Europe at the time. What is interesting is the interaction of different dress styles we see in these testimonies, in the frescoes and the icons, an interaction of different dress styles, which attests to the role of Cypriot women as intermediaries amongst the various ethnic groups. What I mean is that in the 13th and early 14th century, Greek women in Greek churches are Greek women donors, not the saints or Virgin Mother, but the donors on these frescoes or on the icons. Greek women wear a typical Byzantine outfit, while women donors wearing a Western attire are generally identified as Latin. So in the 13th century, we have Greek women dressed in a Byzantine outfit and Latin women in a Western outfit. In the first half of the 14th century, we see that a number of dress styles have been introduced besides the Byzantine one. So the women just choose any style they like: Western, Crusader Levantine, and also a local tradition of fashion, of dress. In the second half of the 14th century, the Byzantine fashion goes out of use, even for the Greeks. And of course, in the 16th century, the Italian fashion is introduced.
I was surprised that in this period, the slave trade actually thrived quite a bit in Cyprus. And of course, many of the slaves in the island were women. And so I'm curious, what was it like to be a female slave in this period? What sort of services were they destined for, and what was typical of their ethnic groups to be a slave in Cyprus?
It's true that at the end of the 13th century, when the Crusader states fall into the hands of the Muslims, Famagusta emerges as a main emporium, and the trade of slaves witnesses an important rise on the island. The trade of slaves will diminish in the 15th and 16th centuries, and one of the main reasons is, I'm happy to say, is the growing social outcry against slavery. Now, we have information about slaves and women slaves in Cyprus from the notarial deeds, but again, as I said at the beginning of our talk, statistics are risky. Now, we can figure out the main ethnic groups women slaves came from. They mainly came from the Black Sea area, the Black Sea region, the shores of the Eastern Mediterranean, so the Aegean, Asia Minor and Greece, the Aegean, and Black Africa. So three areas: Black Sea, Eastern Mediterranean, and Black Africa. So we have Arabs and Turks, Tatars, Russians, Circassians, Bulgarians, Sub Saharan Africans, and Greeks from the Byzantine world, despite church prohibitions for Christian slaves. Now, the gender percentage does not seem to favor either sex. We have more or less an equal number of women and men. These slaves, though, were usually sold at a very, very young age. We have children of the age, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years old. And women and children were usually destined for domestic service. Mm? We don't, whereas men were destined for the fields or for other, hard works, women and children were usually um, sent to homes to be domestic servants. Their masters, male and female, usually enfranchise them in their testaments, which shows the close relationship developed between master and slave. We have cases of um, money collections by the Orthodox Church to free Christian slaves. We also have cases of, in the 15th century especially, of a master who frees his or her slave for the salvation of his or her soul. And also masters who declare that slavery is against natural law and uh, manumit and franchise their slaves in the 15th century, as I said, which shows a change of social attitudes.
Now, as mentioned at the start of this episode, you deal with a lot of notarial documents that gives insight into their lives. And we learn from these that many children are born out of wedlock with local women.
Mhm.
Um, how were they cared for, and were they acknowledged in any way?
The information mainly comes from testaments, wills, written by men, okay? And in these testaments, we see that because of the mainly male character of Famagusta's Italian population, Famagusta was a trade center, so we had many Italians, traders living alone without their Italian families in Famagusta. So this resulted in concubinage and children born out of wedlock with local women. These Italian merchants left their families in Italy. They came to Cyprus, to Famagusta for business. It was a community, a male community. So they had concubines from the local population or their slaves, as perhaps their slaves were their concubines, and they had children born out of these relationships. Illegitimate children were most of the time discriminated against in these testaments, but not neglected. Usually, the father leaves the most of his property to his legitimate children if he had any, but he also provided for his illegitimate children as well as for his illegitimate for his concubine, for his illegitimate wife. So usually bequests to female servants and slaves may be explained by inappropriate relations. We also have documents which demonstrate the dire social and economic situation of an unmarried mother. Usually, these women make a document before the notary in order to entrust their illegitimate children to the care of the father or of another person. And these are really tragic stories.
Towards the end of the medieval period, Cyprus does eventually change hands into the to the Venetians, and then later on to the Ottomans. And I suppose the last question here is what happens to this Latin population of women as well? Had they by then sufficiently blended into the local population, or are they all expelled? And actually, there is a question I neglected to ask earlier. Of the settlers, were they all nobles, or would there also be common people, for a lack of a
No,
better
no, no.
word?
They were not all nobles. No. The problem is that most of the information concerns the nobility, as always. The nobility is overrepresented in the sources, in the written sources of the time. But no, we know that the Latin settlers on the island, there was the ruling class, the Frankish nobility, the feudal ruling class. But then we had many commoners or burgesses who came and settled on the island. We know that most of the Latin population settled in the cities. We know that the countryside, the peasantry, remained Greek. So very little changed in the countryside. The situation when the Lusignans arrived on the island changed mainly for the Greek ruling class, which disappeared, and for the cities, for the burgesses. So we don't have numbers, we don't have statistics, but we may calculate the Latin population, both the nobility and the burgesses, to be something of 20% of the global population, never more. So this 20%, you realize that from the very beginning, they there was cultural interaction with the Greek majority and intermarriage very soon from the end, from the second half of the 13th century. We have evidence that the Frankish, the Latin population of Cyprus, feel Cypriots. They Nothing connects them with Western Europe. They are Cypriots. Their identity is that of the Chyprois in French, Kypriotis in Greek. The Greek Cypriot dialect becomes the mother tongue for the entire population. The only difference is the right. But this is not a difference that divides people. Only at the level of the high clergy do we find confrontation. The simple people don't really care if you are a Latin or an Orthodox, as long as you are Christian.
Sorry, I was going to ask, and do they then essentially blend in to
Oh, they do.
the?
They do. We uh, By the end of the 14th century and throughout the 15th century, we have many Greeks who adopt the Latin rite, intermarry with the Frankish nobility, rise to the ranks of the nobility. So we have social mobility on behalf of the Greeks. On the other hand, we have many French, amongst the burgesses especially, who intermarry with Greeks or Syrians. When the Venetians come, the situation remains the same. The end of the Latin population in Cyprus will come with the Ottoman conquest of the island in 1570-71, because the Venetians were those who fought against the Ottomans. The Ottomans say that we won't accept any Latins, that is, people who observe the Latin rite on the island. So the Latins who stay on Cyprus, they have to adopt either the Orthodox rite or the Muslim religion, or convert to the Muslim religion. So many Latins emigrated, became refugees to Italy and other parts of Western Europe, and we can trace families like that, like the Denores family, for example, in Italy after the Ottoman conquest, whereas other families, Latin families, which stayed on the island, adopted the Orthodox rite and became, Orthodox. The Latin community of Cyprus today is not related with the medieval Latin community of Cyprus. These are Latins who came to Cyprus in the 17th, 18th, 19th century as traders, merchants.
Very interesting.
Very interesting
Um,
indeed. Yeah.
you mentioned the Denoris brothers, and that is a topic of research. A little. This is a little bit unrelated to women
Yes.
in medieval Cyprus right now. This is the topic of research for your next book. Do you mind telling listeners really quickly who these two brothers were and what you're investigating?
They were not brothers, they were uncle and nephew, Pietro de Nores and Giorgio de Nores. Now, the Nores family is the longest surviving Frankish family on Cyprus. Their presence on the island goes back to the beginning of the 13th century. They are amongst the first noble families who came to settle on the island, and the family doesn't die out. The line doesn't die out. The line continues until the Ottoman conquest, and then beyond the Ottoman conquest, in the Cypriot diaspora in Italy. They are refugees. We can find them in Venice, in Rome, and other towns in Italy. Pietro de Nores was the son of Jason de Nores. Jason de Nores was a very, very educated Cypriot. He was a professor at the University of Padua. He an author. He left a great number of books, and Pietro had a very, very, let's say, naughty youth. He was, and all this survives in the Venetian archives. The information comes from the Venetian archives. Apparently he was a wild youth, and he killed a Venetian patrician, a Venetian aristocrat, in a duel in Venice sometime when he was in the late 16th century. So he was convicted, and his father managed to send him to Rome before he was imprisoned. In Rome, he became secretary of popes and cardinals, and he led an exemplary life, which doesn't remind his wild beginnings. He worked as a secretary of at the Curia, at the Roman Curia of popes and cardinals. He knew the most important politicians, military men, men of letters of the time. He was a friend of Torquato Tasso, of Francesco Patrizzi, and he also left an important literary output, which is unpublished because, unlike his father, Pietro de Nores was not known until I started working on him. Now, he had a nephew, this guy, Giorgio, who left only one historical treatise in which he tries to convince powers, the political powers of the time, Venice, the Pope, the French king, to organize a crusade in order to liberate Cyprus from the Ottomans. And he actually went to Germany and fought in the wars of religion, between the religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, in order to gain the necessary military experience and go to Cyprus and help to liberate Cyprus. Unfortunately, he died very young, at the age of 19. And we know that through his uncle's correspondence. So these two Cypriots of the diaspora are really, I don't know, I find them really very touching because they live in Rome and Venice, and they still dream of their homeland, and they still try to liberate their homeland. Cyprus is their homeland, and they also represent Cyprus abroad in a very, very respectable and honorary way. So I plan to publish some of Pietro's works, but It takes time.
Well, it sounds very fascinating, and
Well,
I'm
it's like a
definitely
movie story, I mean, it's really, and the historical investigation in cases like that, it's like detective work, really.
on. It sounds amazing, and I'm really looking forward to it. Do you have a timeline when you think it will be published?
Well, in a couple of years, probably.
Got it. Thank you so much for coming back on. This is a period that doesn't get a lot of attention, and just to have you share with the wider audience your knowledge, your wealth of knowledge, it's so appreciated, and I can't express my gratitude enough.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Absolutely. Take care. Have a great night.
You too. Bye bye.